our webinar on navigating the future of childcare, insights for childcare business owners. We are super excited to have our special guest, Radha Mohan. She's the Executive Director of the Early Care and Education Consortium. Our host will be our amazing Tony D'Agostino. He's the founder and CEO of Inspire Care 360. Please join our chat. Let us know that you're here. It looks like we have participants coming in. Just put your name and where you're from so that we can welcome you. I'm in sunny Florida right now. We are excited to have you. Sarah Dixon is on here. She is one of our marketing. She's going to be posting some links in the chat. So stay tuned in there when we mention links. Make sure you look for those links in the chat. Hi, David from Virginia, and Gloria from, looks like Massachusetts, Michelle from Texas. Hi, Andrea, Rose Tree Early Learning Center in Pennsylvania. Estella, welcome. Thank you for joining our webinar. I have quite a few family in Texas, so we have a few Texans on here. Perfect. It's exciting to see all of you joining us. There's Kay Woods from Arizona. Hi, Kay. Welcome to the webinar. My name is Jessica Wright. I'm the Executive Vice President of Inspire Care 360. I'll be your MC today, kind of introducing the host and getting things kicked off. Hi, Robin in Chicago. Hopefully it's starting to warm up a little up there. Renee in Houston, Texas. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. As I mentioned before, some of you jumped on, we have a great guest speaker today, Radha Mohan, and she is with Early Care and Education Consortium. She's the executive director there, so we're excited for the topics she's bringing to the table today. Again, once you jump on with us, please pop in and tell us your name and where you are from. Hi, Radha. I know we jumped on there, but we got a little view of her face. All right, we still have some joining us. That's great. Please pop in the chat. Let us know where you're from. Say hi. There's Amy from Philadelphia. Hi, Amy. Welcome. Also, during this, please feel free to put any questions and answers. We have a Q&A section down there. Those will go directly to our panelists. So please put any questions in there. We'll try to answer those questions or just some thoughts in the chat. Hi, Ella from California. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. All right. So today we're going to, we'll have our welcome here coming up. We have a few housekeeping items. We have an excellent in-house CDA program that Tony's going to talk a little bit about, and our ECE Healthy Advantage, which I'm actually a member of our Healthy Advantage. You'll learn a little more about that today and how affordable it is for an employer and employees. We'll get into introducing our wonderful guest, and then get into our discussion. And at the end, you'll learn a little bit more about Inspire Care 360. This is our webinar certificate here. Sarah's going to put that link in the chat as well. So if you're seeking a CEU certificate, please copy and paste that link. And those certificates, we will get those out to you. If for any reason you have any trouble There'll be some contact information at the end, so reach out. But just copy this link, put it in your web browser, and sign up to get your certificate so you get credit for this. As I mentioned, Tony D'Agostino, he's our founder and CEO. Tony actually owns and operates 4 schools out in Western New York. He has several years of experience. We won't go into that too much, but he founded IC360 and just came up with the amazing solutions. And we're excited to have him hosting today.
Thank you so much, Jessica. I greatly appreciate it. You're looking at someone who is really substantial in our industry right here with Jessica. She came into our world over a year ago and really has made some wonderful relationships as well as deep-seated trust and relationships with our staff, with our members, along with our community. So thank you so much, Jessica, for emceeing us today.
Thank you, Tony.
We'll talk to you in just a little bit. Thank you. So I'm going to take it over from here. So folks, welcome today for our event. We are really excited to have Radha on today. I have to do a few housekeeping items. Before I do that, I'm going to do a new share. One thing that you should all know is that with what we do in our with our webinars is we also have a podcast. These webinars, as well as other content, are being also produced after these events, not only for replay as a webinar for anybody who attends, but we have a podcast channel. And the podcast channel is Care for the Childcare Owner podcast. This podcast channel has a long series of different podcasts that we've had over the years. Wonderful content, wonderful individuals who have all participated in developing that podcast. It has been a wonderful event for all of us to participate on that. And now we hear a lot more people who are downloading that, whether using Apple, Spotify, Google. We're probably on about 20 different platforms out there. And if there's a platform that you use and you would like us to be on there for a podcast, please let us know. The great part about those podcasts are that once it's downloaded, it automatically downloads to your library. And then if you're in the car, in a plane, in some place where you just want to be able to listen at your convenience, you'll be able to listen. We do also have a very special podcast channel coming up that's a little different for Care for the Childcare Owner. This one I'm just going to mention, it's going to be coming out in the next month or so. And that new podcast is going to be without webinars. It's an exclusive podcast, and it is called ECE CEO Biography, Sage Wisdom for Childcare Leaders. When this does come out, it will still be on the same channel is Care for the Childcare Owner. If you download that channel, you will have these, but these are exclusive. We are talking to CEOs of large national childcare programs. So such as those with Lightbridge Academy, Endeavor Schools, Big Blue Marble, New Horizons Academy. And what we're doing there is we're really interviewing different levels of CEOs from very large to smaller entities and getting a discussion going with them on how they ascended into the role they have, both in leadership as well as business, as well as into the childcare space. The learnings that they had, where the mistakes that they've had throughout their career, and how they fixed those, how they remedied them, and how they've moved. The thing that's been amazing, we already have a bunch of them in the can that we are going to be able to start rolling out, about 1 a month. Maybe we might even go to 2 a month, but those podcasts are super insightful. And what I've found about all of these CEOs and these leaders is that they're very humble, they're super kind, and they're ultimately focused on their staff and their kids as primary focus, but they have some wonderful insights, a lot more to come. So look out for that coming. I am seeing that we have a slide deck here. So let's go forward and talk about the fact that if you are unaware, we offer a full CDA program for our members, but we also do have a non-member rate too if you're not with us. But for our members, it's a 121-hour program that is delivered online through Inspire University at $199 a participant. The great part is, we all know in most states, your teachers must meet requirements to be a teacher in that classroom. This CDA allows that to happen. It also allows you to really recruit and retain the very best team members because you don't always have to recruit a certified teacher or someone who has their associate's degree. This is sort of the equivalency in many states of an associate's degree. You will also see the $99 renewal. Before CDAs were so pricey, it was a big investment, usually for the staff member. Took months on end to do, going to classes almost around $1,000 just for the training and development. This is $199 for the whole 121 hours. That one extra hour that goes from the 120 to 121 is something unique that we have in the industry, and that's a portfolio builder. Most people, when they go through their CDA, quite often get stuck at the point where they have to build their own portfolio to then work with the CDA national accreditation accreditors, because they have to also go through the accreditation and they have to have a portfolio built for that. So we've added a portfolio builder in there, and it really walks an individual through how they need to build their portfolio, what it should represent and what it should look like. We also have our member advocates who truly help guide those things. So super affordable. If you want to learn more, check the links in our Q&A. Again, if you have any questions, please put in the Q&A section. If you have comments for one another or for, let's say, Sarah or Jessica or the company, you can put those in the chat function. So we've also talked about a lot in the past about ECE Healthy Advantage, and just want to bring it to light again. Super affordable and flexible. We probably have 1 to 2 companies who are coming on board a week with Healthy Advantage, a substantial program. It has 5 healthcare benefit options accepted throughout the nation, mostly with all of your major, primary care physicians, internal medicine, and also most of the specialists in the areas. But there's also 6 supplemental care programs. And if you look at the bottom here, you will notice that there are like $15 office and specialist visits, no high premiums, no deductibles at all. This is from $1. For the premiums for the owner who's offering it, for the first 10 people, it's $50 per person. That's it. You're not splitting half of a $400 bill per month, and $25 per person after the first 10. They all include telemedicine. It meets the Affordable Care Act, and it offers full benefit administration with payroll administration. So definitely would like, if anybody out there has an interest in it, shoot a chat to Jessica or Sarah and say, hey, I'd like to learn a little bit more, and we'll set up a time to meet with you and talk to you through that information. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to introduce Radha. So Radha, if you'd like to come online, there she is now. Wonderful to see you. How you doing?
Hi, Tony. Thank you so much for having me here today.
Oh, no problem at all. So Radha, in addition to be a highly seasoned attorney, someone who has a lot of experience in things that are very important to our industry, is the executive director at the Early Care and Education Consortium. And that title down there is a little messed up because that's not really the name of it, but the Early Care and Education Consortium, I think I have correct. Is that right, Radha?
Yes, that is correct.
All right, awesome. And, very focused on the whole grassroots effort of advocacy. Today's conversation is really going to be a lot about advocacy, not only with what we will describe and talk to you about with Radha's group, with the ECEC, but we'll also talk about why possibly people who are on this call should get involved with advocacy. So there's a lot of things that come in through legislation, and some of the wonderful work that Radha and her team work on is really about translating what comes out of these massive bills and opportunities and block grants to translate how that affects you directly in your state. So with that, Radha and myself, and I think I have, for some reason, I got a deck. I'm going to reshare a deck here because I think I have two different decks, and I'm going to make sure I have the right one here. Bear with me 1 second, Radha. Okay.
No problem.
All right. So, Radha, why don't you tell us a little bit about ECEC?
Sure, happy to do that. ECEC is the Early Care and Education Consortium, and we are essentially the only voice at the federal and state level that advocates for multi-state, multi-site providers across all policy tables. ECEC's membership is essentially comprised of about 7,000 plus centers. In addition to that, we also have associate members that are state associations, and then child care service providers as well. Collectively, our members serve about 1 million children nationwide across 48 states and the District of Columbia. And we are really focused on bringing quality to scale across the nation.
And that's when you say quality to scale across the nation, what does that really mean in the sense of for our childcare owners and operators who are on this call?
Great question, Tony. In terms of bringing quality to scale, I think there are a lot of solutions that are put forward in an industry like this one. It is highly regulated, and every state and on the federal level, there are a lot of ideas about how we can fix childcare, how we can change childcare, how we can improve childcare. There are only a handful of solutions that really work to put forward a high quality model that actually works for the service providers, so that works for the providers on this call, for example, and then also works from a political perspective, a policy perspective, and then actually helps children and families. And that's the role that ECEC plays, serving as a conduit between all the different stakeholders and making sure that policy proposals that are making it across the finish line ultimately are things that'll work for providers and that'll actually improve the marketplace and help children and families as well.
All right. Thank you for that detailed description. So for those of you who are in our audience today, we'd love to see your questions when we're talking to someone like Radha. One of the interesting things, I've been to a lot of different events. I happened to meet Radha at one of Kathy Ligon's Shift events, just a wonderful event, as we know. She does a wonderful job there, Kathy and her team do. And I heard Radha on stage and had talked to her briefly after some of the conversations. One of the things that's really coalesced for me was the depth that ECEC does get into the legislation, both not only in helping interpret it, but really helping lead it and getting the focus on that. So before we really, I do have a few questions for you, and I definitely would like our audience, if they do have some questions. But when you look at advocacy, why did you get involved in this? Why did you get involved, Radha, in ECEC?
That's a great question. And actually, it goes back to when I first had kids. And ECEC has been around for decades, but they recognized about 6 or 7 years ago that they needed to change directions. And that while there were a lot of advocacy organizations that represented various stakeholders in this space, very well-respected organizations, there were very few or none that really spoke on these issues for providers. And so they were looking for new representation, and I interviewed along with Brownstein to represent them. And I think what really motivated me was I just had my first child. And this was something that I had just started to learn more about. I have always been involved in the early education space from the tax angle. So I'm a tax attorney by trade and did a lot of work on incentives for children and families on the tax side, and then incentives that wind up helping providers as well. But I was given the opportunity to get involved from a different angle, and I'm so glad that I took it.
Well, that's wonderful. I do always wonder, and I have to ask people when they deal with Washington, it is something that could have your heart pound a little bit. How has it been to engage and deal with legislators, Washington, the politics of it all? Have you found it to be what we probably perceive as a challenging labyrinth of different avenues to get things done, or have you found a means to get our message across directly to those who probably are empowered to be helpful to our industry?
Tony, again, I think this industry has such a great story to tell. And I think, unfortunately, sometimes when you work in DC, when you work in politics, you sort of see all the different industries with a mouthpiece come to the table and try to tell their story, right? And some folks have more means than this industry does. So I don't know that this is a story that always was one that reached the ears of legislators, and that's something that we've really worked to change. This industry has such a wonderful story to tell. It is an enabler, an economic enabler. And I think during the pandemic, that's really when we were able to break through to lawmakers and get them to understand firsthand what it meant for families to go without high quality childcare, and what the economic impact of that was, and really what the human impact of that was for children, families, and teachers as well. So that's when I think we really started to change the narrative around early education, change the narrative around an issue that was once very much considered a personal issue, often a woman's issue, and bring it to the forefront as something that businesses should be focused on and legislators should be focused on. And I think, honestly, it's been a privilege to be able to do this work, to go to lawmakers and to tell them about the work that all of the providers on this call do, to tell them the stories of your teachers and the families that you serve. And I think lawmakers recognize that, again, especially during the pandemic, when this industry received $52 billion worth of funding in order to ensure that high quality providers were able to remain in business and provide services to children and families.
Well, I really appreciate that answer. For those of you who are on the call and might not know myself very well, I own and operate 4 schools in Western New York, and I work with a lot of other owners throughout the nation. I do know that it was interesting coming out of the pandemic through the PPP loans, and then the CARES Acts, and then eventually stabilization grants and things of that nature. It seems like a lot of that are starting to wind down. I do know that many states had very different policies of how they rolled out those dollars. Some of them, when I was in New York, we would see people in Delaware and friends in Delaware and in Ohio and down in Florida and Georgia, we'd see these dollars flowing to them, where in some states like New York, they were all held back. And I know that now there's a push again through the block grant to sort of take a look at those things. So why don't we talk a little bit about from where we were, since a lot of us know that some of those dollars have ended, to where we're going. What is the state and federal position right now of availability of the kind of funds that we need, especially for trying to attract the right kind of teachers and to have them stay with us?
I'm going to start with the federal, mostly
Please.
because I have some good news to deliver on that front.
Great.
A few weeks ago, when the appropriations bill was signed into law, CCDBG received a $725 million funding increase, making the program total about $8.7 billion, or a 10% increase. The funding is very timely. Tony, as you said, the stabilization funding is coming to an end in September 2024, so in about 5 months. Now, will $725 million replace the quantums that I just mentioned earlier? Absolutely not. But the purpose of the block grant is very different, right? It's there to serve low-income families and incentivize providers to be able to participate in that program. And I think the $725 million increase will allow us to do just that. It'll allow states to increase reimbursement rates, which essentially means that you can pay your teachers more. And I think states recognize that they're going to have to make very difficult decisions. And in some cases, it means that there may be a temporary decrease in access for families in order to ensure that we're shoring up support for providers and that we are taking care of reimbursement rates, taking care of quality, making sure that teachers have adequate wages before we scale up to serve the number of families that need to be served. But again, that increase is going to help ensure that more than, the 15% of families that currently are eligible and have access to see that number go up as well.
So you mentioned something that it's a little bit of one step back for families, for maybe a large step forward with the decreased access for families. Tell me a little bit about how that applies. And by the way, when you're talking about, the CCDGB, you're talking about what we commonly call the block grant, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Okay.
Subsidy program serves low-income families, different names in different states sometimes, but yes, generally the block grant.
Okay, great. So you mentioned about decreased access for families temporarily while some of these funds start to get applied. Tell us a little bit more about that. What does that mean?
Sure. And some of this actually traces back to the finalization of the CCDF rule as well. And what the CCDF rule, that's the it's the Childcare Development Fund, which is the overall fund under which the block grant sits. And essentially, the rules and regulations around CCDBG were just updated by HHS, which is the agency that oversees Health and Human Services, which oversees the administration of the block grant. Now, there were some very positive changes made to the regulations on CCDBG, or the block grant. First, there is a cap on family copay, which basically means that states cannot charge families more than 7% of their income, and any differential in what the provider would lose in states where the copay is above 7%, the state will essentially need to pick up in order to ensure that providers remain whole. Now, in addition to that, they also made changes where they're encouraging reimbursement rates to go up. And they're making some tangible changes in terms of payment policies. So, for example, they're going to require payment based on enrollment versus attendance, which is a huge benefit to providers.
That is, I have to tell you, that you probably hear all the time. And is that something at the federal level that will scale through states? Because I know states tend to wield a pretty big stick when it comes to changing how they allocate the block grant. So are these federal mandates that must be adhered to by the state?
Yes, they are. States have a 2-year waiver period. So some states like Ohio have already indicated that they're likely going to exercise that waiver. But after that, there are no more waivers, and states will essentially have to implement these policies. So all of these things come at a cost, right? So when you're
course.
talking about categorical eligibility for a new subset of providers, when you're talking about changes to these policies, capping co-payments for families, all of these things come at a cost. And as a result of that, in discussions with lawmakers and regulators, what we understand is that they understand that it may temporarily reduce access in that states are not able to serve as many families as they work to implement the changes that were required by the final rule. But eventually, if we are successful in our advocacy work, the 725 million will continue to grow. So we have a vision laid out by Senator Susan Collins, who is currently the ranking member of the Senate Appropriations Committee, that basically pushes to double CCDBG over 5 years. That vision was laid out 2 years ago, and we are currently on track to do just that. So hopefully at the end of year 5, we will have doubled CCDBG from where it was a few years ago. And then, of course, Senator Patty Murray, who is currently the chair of the committee, is very much on board with that vision and would probably like to do even more than that for childcare. But that's what the current political environment allows.
So that's interesting. That is really good news in the sense that there is a focus. They're looking to double it. There is opportunity. As you say, it always comes at a cost. And I do have a couple questions that gets us in the weeds a little bit, but I'm coming from the owner perspective too. When you say that it may, and I'm not sure if you are at this level with it, but it may restrict some of the families, are they looking to basically, I guess, edit or modify the level to poverty to restrict, or are they just saying processing applications?
It's the latter more.
Oh, it is.
So I don't think they're going to be reducing. I would have a very hard time seeing states further roll back eligibility. So, if they're currently at 45th percentile, I have a tough time potentially seeing them move down to 30th percentile of state median income or whatever else it is. There are some states that have already had to do that because of the pandemic funding ending. So for example, Georgia was serving 85th percentile through the pandemic, now no longer serving 85th percentile. They've gone back to their pre-pandemic levels. So you may see some additional states sort of roll off their pandemic numbers to pre-pandemic or make adjustments over there. But generally, I think what this means is processing new applications. So we're hopeful that folks that already have eligibility and are currently being served through the program won't see a loss of access to care. But in terms of new families being able to be served, that's where we might see a lag for a period.
That's okay. That makes sense. It is going to be probably a bit challenging for those families because I think, and the reason I ask about the modification of the poverty level for access is what it may do is create a better organized way to distribute the dollars as to just people not knowing whether they're going to be approved or not, which is very difficult for families when they're putting in applications and don't know if they're going to qualify when they do qualify based on the poverty level.
And Tony, I think they're looking to make improvements to that as well. So a lot of the regulatory guidance essentially mandated changes to how we're dealing with families as well. Not only do the applications have to be more accessible, but they've also required that eligibility determinations be made within a certain period of time. On top of that, they've required or suggested a process whereby if families qualify for other federal benefits, that determination you can carry that determination over to CCDBG as well. So hopefully in the next year or two, as the regulatory guidance gets implemented on the state level, families should also observe that this is it is easier to actually access the benefit, whereas before it might have been a little bit more of a challenge. So I think that, coupled with the 7% copayment cap, is actually a very positive development for families.
Wonderful. As we talk, and I know that obviously we can't talk about all 50 states, and I'm not going to be selfish enough just to talk about the state my schools are in, because I serve Inspire Care 360 across all states, and those are, everybody here that we're all interested in. Is there creating any kind of uniformity throughout states for distribution of the block grants in the future, or is it, genuinely up to the state on its abilities to distribute? And the second part of that question is are the states going to be asked to come to the table with funds and investment in the block grant themselves, in addition to the federal side of tax dollars?
So two things on that front. One, in terms of uniformity, unlikely apart from the regulatory guidance, right? I mean, we have a patchwork system in this country in large part because of the way the overall system sort of works beyond childcare, beyond education.
Sure.
Education, even at the K through 12 level, is largely local. State and local standards prevail. So while there's a framework that's being put forward by the feds, and they're tightening that framework, and they're making a lot of positive improvements to that framework, ultimately state implementation, you'll see variations on how they wind up implementing the guidance. And that's true even for something like payment based on enrollment versus attendance, right? So states are going to define this differently. There's some guidance at the federal level, but ultimately the number of absent days covered, all of that is going to vary from state to state. We do have an advocacy platform on this. We push out, for example, the American Pediatric Association has some data on how often a young child misses school during those early years. And it's a lot because they're sick all the time. So we do have guidance that we push out to states and urge them to consider, but ultimately it's a little bit of a patchwork. Now, your second question about the funding is a really interesting one, because the block grant itself does have a requirement for a certain percentage of funding be matched. But I think looking beyond the block grant for a minute, as ARPA stabilization dollars come to an end, this is where states are really trying to step up, or at least some states are trying to step up and bridge the gap, recognizing that this is often a number 1, 2, 3 issue for voters. So often it comes right behind housing, where families are saying, we need childcare, we need access to childcare, we need the state to make investments, we need the feds to make investments. So just for a minute, I want to highlight a couple of states. Minnesota is probably at the top of my list for states that are doing positive things. Minnesota was the first state to dedicate resources to continue their stabilization program, originally developed with the ARPA funding. The Great Start Compensation Support Payment Program. It's a mouthful, but essentially it's funded through 2027 to help providers cover their staffing expenses, which, as we all know, is one of the biggest costs that providers face. Minnesota also recently increased reimbursement rates. Again, that should help providers meet their expenses. Illinois, as another positive development, a lot of programs that were developed with ARPA funding have been extended with state resources, including transitioning providers in 2024 from the federal stabilization program to the Childcare Workforce Compensation Contracts program, which is again intended to provide bedrock funding or stable funding for all providers so that they can offer higher wages. Then there are other states that are making more general investments or revamping their systems in different ways. I'll talk about, Colorado and Michigan, for example, made permanent a COVID era policy that would pay providers based on enrollment versus attendance. So they have already implemented some of what the federal regulatory guidance is requiring. Colorado has also been revamping their pre-K system for a couple of years now, and has made a lot of positive strides on that front. It's a mixed delivery universal pre-K model, and one that we really tout and encourage other states to follow suit. Just to give you a quick flavor of what some other folks are doing, New York has made a lot of investments in the childcare workforce. They've got the Workforce Retention Grant Program. They've got an employer childcare tax credit. They've got a pilot program with employers that they are putting forward, and then an expansion of the Empire State Child Credit as well. A lot of states, Michigan, Kentucky, amongst others, are also looking at TriShare, which is an employer-based program as well. So again, you know, I could go on and on about what different states are doing, but I'll pause there. I think it gives you a little bit of a flavor of what's coming down the pipeline.
Yeah. Well, and I know directly from New York, even though it seems like they're doing a number of things candidly, it is certainly a mixed bag. You know, and of course, there's going to be winners, there's going to be losers, there's going to be opportunities, and they're trying new things. One of the things that's been a struggle in the state, New York, and I think it has been for other states, is really finding a way to support the recruitment and retention of quality staff, whether or not you're doing social service programs or you're just looking, you know, for our industry to be recognized as such a valuable industry, and the margins being so thin that it's difficult to, you know, have, you know, the owner operators invest at the level they need to compete with the school districts and the like. So with that said, do you see anything that uniformly is coming down from the federal level as to the, you know, that would be, you know, possibly proposed as a framework on raising and how to connect with the quality of teachers in the programs overall?
You know, unfortunately, it's a tough question to answer, because I think you're going to see states, I think states understand that that is a priority for childcare providers, but ultimately you're going to see a patchwork in terms of what states ultimately do and how they address the issue. I think the compensation grants, I think a lot of those things were intended to address some of that. But unfortunately, I think it's a patchwork in terms of what states are actually going to wind up doing.
Okay. You mentioned when you're talking about Colorado, something that's very also near and dear to a lot of our hearts in a way, not always positive and not always negative, but is universal pre-K and universal, you know, kindergarten. When pre-kindergarten, when we have talked about these programs, there, you know, right now, for instance, in New York State, it is run by, you know, the Department of Education in New York State. It is not run through the child care licensing. It's not run through any advocacy on child care. And, you know, I know that in a number of different states, there is some feeling that CBOs or, you know, schools like ours sometimes are underfunded based on the funding that these school districts have, and every school district is applying those different. I know, for instance, I may make a decision not to support the UPK programs because the reimbursement levels are so low in our state that we would have, honestly, for 15 children we would take on for a UPK program, one private pay child would replace the whole program. So that's when you look at where UPK is going. Do you have a little bit of an insight on where they see UPK going?
And again, you know, hard to talk about sort of the national perspective because every state is so different on UPK, but I'll give you sort of a couple of examples and then a overarching way to think about the advocacy work that we do in this space. One, when we talk about pre-K, we recognize that every state wants to do this differently. And even though we go to states and we tell them about the models that actually work and what the secret sauce is in order to have a successful UPK program, every governor, every legislator, they want to do it their own way. One of the key predictors of success for any UPK program is what you just highlighted a second ago, Tony, which is who runs the actual program. Is it the Department of Education? Is it the state child care agency? What is the flow of funding? And again, based on the studies that we've done and the interviews of providers, there are always exceptions to the rule, but generally it works best when school districts don't get that money directly and it flows through an independent agency.
Yeah.
There are very few instances where it works when the school districts directly get that funding and are responsible for doling it out. Now, oh, sorry.
No. I was agreeing with you because in contrast, and the reason is because there's competing interests, right?
Exactly.
And there's competing interests to try to keep teachers in the school district, for instance. And, and I just talk about New York State because that's where my schools are, but everybody else here. And I have a question from someone in our audience too here in a moment. Their oftentimes motives may be, to grow their, because a lot of people move out of different states, they want to grow and keep their teachers. So bringing pre-K in-house makes a lot more sense than sending it out to CBOs. So there are a lot of opportunities there. One of our guests asked, how can they really get involved? And I see you just did a response to Johnny on here, but he was asking, how do I gain more traction in a state? And he answered Alabama. When you think about gaining traction at the state level, where I know you're mainly at the federal level, where would you start? Because I know that a number of owners for us in New York State have also come together and are looking to gain some traction.
So actually, we just a quick note on that. Yes, we are a national organization, but we have lobbyists or lobbying operations in about a dozen states now. New York State is one of those states, and actually our members are up on the Hill in New York today, right now, talking to state legislators about the various issues that affect them both on the city and state level, but they're doing their advocacy day in Albany today. To answer, I guess, a couple of things. One, we have resources that we put together that talk about the importance of mixed delivery, the economics of the childcare model. When you're pulling those 3 and 4 year olds out, what does that do to the cost of care in the 0 to 3 market? Legislators don't understand that. And what we recommend to everyone is invite legislators to come to your programs and have that conversation with them as they walk through your school. Infant toddler ratios are much lower. So if you've got 1:3 or 1:4, that looks very different than 1:10 in a pre-K classroom, right? So your quantums in terms of labor just look different. And sometimes they have to be in a classroom to understand that. Not all programs are created equal. We all aspire to the highest quality possible. But as a legislator walks through your classroom, if you have an appropriately constructed playground or a play space or bathrooms that are built for young children, right? The little details, curriculum, whatever it is, they can see it and experience it, and then you can explain to them the cost that's associated with providing all of that. And again, the advantage of delivery through our schools versus public programs, because again, we have purpose-built facilities, we have continuity of care. There are so many things that our providers do better because we have the expertise.
Right.
And I think that's where having a legislator come to your classroom, doing the walkthroughs, it's a great way to demonstrate versus some of the advocacy work that I do, right? Where I'm talking to members, but they're not necessarily experiencing it or living it. I think that's very different. I think in terms of in terms of that's sort of the overarching work that you can do across all states, talking about mixed delivery, right? Talking about funding streams and all of that. Tony, you brought up New York and reimbursement rates. And I think that's the other thing that's common across all states, encouraging lawmakers to provide adequate reimbursement rates, because when they do, you solve the access crisis as well. More providers are actually willing to participate, and that helps low-income families, that helps the businesses in the community. And then we also encourage them not to just focus on public dollars and those sorts of programs, but think about marrying private investment into the system as well. And that's where TriShare, the tax credits, all of those things come into play as well. And you stitch together different funding streams to make it work. I think Colorado, Florida, Georgia are all positive examples of states that have gotten the system right. Now, reimbursement rates, from what I understand from my providers in states like Georgia, have gone down over time. So while the system and the framework might work, you also have to make sure that investments keep up with cost of living and cost of inflationary adjustments as well.
Sure. And I would, I would really reinforce what you just mentioned to all of us on the call here, is just what you said about getting your local legislators into your schools. At the end of the day, your local legislators, you are part of the community, and they are representative of yours. They also like to meet and greet at a childcare. You can be pretty confident that they like to come out, because it is such a hot topic on both sides of the aisle. Number one. But number two, I think, Radha, what you really mentioned is critical, is for you to demonstrate why a school, or when I say a school, I'm talking about childcare centers that we have, why we're there and why we are different in supporting, as to like the public schools or any kind of other third party that would pop up to manage these kind of programs, because there is a significant difference. I do know that when I was going through the last negotiations for UPK programs with the school district I dealt with, I had actually done the math for them. I showed them the reimbursement rates. I showed them the costs associated with everything. I showed them where it came down to realistically what a regular individual enrollment would be against their entire program. And it opened a lot of eyes at the board level. They had never seen that. They had not had anybody in the childcare realm, because they're all different. There's thousands and thousands of boards of school districts around here that have just been given these dollars, or entities for those who are run by the school boards, and they do not understand how it affects the CBO, that if you pull the 4-year-olds and the 3-year-olds from these programs stop becoming profitable for the most part, because of the ratios of staff to children. It's very difficult to run programs that are just for infant and toddlers and not charge an exorbitant amount to families. Those preschoolers, those school age kids, all part of your program, are key mixes for a childcare school to be profitable. So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts, but I think that your guidance there is very valuable in that area.
I know I didn't fully answer the question in the chat. But what I'll say at a high level is there are a lot of states that don't have a state advocacy sort of organization or a state association. Tony, I know you mentioned New York as one of those states where it's more informal coalitions. We do advocacy work on the state level, but I think a couple of things. One, we've worked with providers before to start advocacy organizations, walk them through sort of how you do that and how you go about doing that. I think from ECEC's perspective, we need folks on the ground like all of you to personalize the story and tell the story from your perspective as a constituent to state legislators. So for anyone that's interested, if you'd like to have a deeper conversation about how you go about doing that advocacy work, I do have a great team of state GR folks that would be more than happy to help provide a little bit of guidance, or at least have a call and talk through what some of those issues might be. The only way that we're going to achieve success for the industry, and then consequently for children, families, and educators, is by having boots on the ground in every single state. So
Yeah.
Happy to help.
Yeah, so, I think that's wonderful. And I think that your team, I know working with Sage and the team, they've just been absolutely wonderful, very sharp. Um, we're coming close to our time, so I want you to pull out your crystal ball for a second. As we get into this election year, I know both sides of the aisle are talking about childcare. It's obviously something that cultivates votes for some. Some of them are very passionate about it, of what the future of development of the next generation of children are. And there's everybody in between. As you sort of see the, I guess you would say, the environment today out there and, the political rhetoric, where do you see overall whether different sides of the aisle tend to win this coming fall? What do you sort of see as the future going down in the near future based on the elections that are coming up?
Sure. So conventional wisdom from the political pundits, for whatever stock you want to put in that, is that the House and the Senate are going to flip. So the House is currently currently controlled by Republicans. They expect it to flip to Democrats with a very small with a very small margin. And then on the Senate side, it's currently controlled by Democrats. We expect that to flip to Republicans. Now, the presidency is a toss-up. No one really knows how that's going to go. And the expectation is, if we have a divided Congress with a Democratic president, it is likely that we could see some significant movement in the space of childcare, namely through a reauthorization of the block grant and some other investments in the program. If we have a divided Congress and a Republican president, right now they have not, we have no indication that childcare is going to be something that is going to rise to the top for the current Republican frontrunner. So the Trump campaign team, the Trump policy folks have really not said much about childcare so far. So we don't expect it to be an issue of major interest to at least a Republican administration. Now that said,
yeah, so let me ask you this, and I'm sure everybody has their own political views on all these things, as all of us do. There was recently, to the last congressional election, really, it was all Democrat from the administration to the Senate to Congress. Was there a major movement that happened for those 2 years? Was there the child care movement, did it really grow during those 2 years?
Did. And honestly, CCDBG has a history of bipartisan support. So it isn't just Democrats that support the program. As I mentioned, Senator Collins is a Republican, and she's a staunch advocate. The Republican from Alabama, Representative Adderholt, has been a champion for the industry, and he is a Republican. Burgess Owens, there are a number of Republicans. So I certainly don't want to give folks the impression that the block grant is partisan. It's more a question with the with a Trump administration whether childcare would be prioritized, and so far our answer is no, based on what we've seen. In terms of Democrats, yes, they outlined a vision in Build Back Better that would have really changed the landscape of early education. Ultimately, the legislation did not pass, and we are working to improve the legislation and have conversations about what should potentially be done differently next time around, because there were issues. And then, funding really increased significantly during a Democratic administration. While some of the stabilization funding was bipartisan, a good chunk of it that was passed through ARPA was partisan funding that Democrats did through a reconciliation bill, where only Democrats voted for the legislation, right? So we definitely have seen monumental investments in childcare funding under a Democratic administration. There is the flip side to that as well, though, and many of you might have seen the backlash against for-profit childcare, which is interesting because 75%, 80% plus of childcare in this country is actually for-profit. And then even further backlash against private equity-owned childcare in this country. And a lot of that comes from the far left and from some of the advocates in this space. So while there's positive, there's also negative that the industry has to watch out for and be prepared for as well.
Yeah, and I was going to mention that when you were talking about, because a lot of the things, I think there was a lot of rhetoric associated, a lot of pushing it, but then things never really passed, and that was one of the challenges. A lot of people did it, and so we can go down that political rabbit hole, which we won't spend much time on at all. But the fact is, I think it's important for everybody to take up advocacy to some level. It is really our role within this world when it gets to, looking at your programs, and most of the people on here are for-profit. There are some non-for-profit, and I know that the for-profit get scrutinized significantly more than a nonprofit does when it comes down to this. But at the end of the day, we're all in the same game of just helping develop the most amazing kids of the next generation. So without having your voice heard, it's sort of like they say, if you don't play, you can't win. And I say that about advocacy as we wind up this presentation here. If you don't participate in the program overall in sort of going for advocacy for your schools, for your region, for your locale, it's hard for you to have a voice, and it's hard for us to change things. So, we all see the same issues coming about, and I would highly recommend that you participate in some level of advocacy. You're welcome to reach out to us. There's, in addition to ECEC, there's NCCA nationally that does some advocacy, and there are local state entities for advocacy. So there's an opportunity to work with Radha and her team, as well as we can try to help you give as much guidance if you reach out to IC360. So with our only a minute or two left, one of the things I'd like Radha to be able to do is say, what is the benefits of, being a member of ECEC?
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Tony. ECEC is a member-driven organization. So we are only as powerful as, our members allow us to be, in that we have strength in numbers as an industry. So what ECEC does is convene high-quality multi-state, multi-site providers, or multi-site providers, really, and bring them to the table so that they have a voice in every major policy discussion that affects the industry. We want to make sure that our stakeholders, their points of view and the work that they do every day is messaged properly to folks that are actually writing the policy and putting together the regulatory guidance that winds up governing this industry. So that's our goal overall. In terms of benefits, we offer federal advocacy services, state advocacy services across about a dozen plus states. As we grow, if we have members join with a very large presence in a particular state, we're always happy to add to our footprint. In addition to the, advocacy services, conversations with lawmakers, representation at all of the policy tables, what we also do is cover industry events, right? Talking points, educate folks about the, educate folks about the industry, put together events, and then keep our members informed of what's happening, not just in the states in which they operate, but really what's happening nationally with early education, so that they can get ahead of the policy trends and plan proactively for their businesses.
And that's absolutely wonderful. I will say that ECEC has really been a leader out there for the federal advocacy. They have a number of the largest childcare providers in the nation, working on their board. But as I've talked recently to Radha and her team, they are also looking to greatly penetrate and hear the voices of the independently owned and operated schools throughout the nation. And I know that they're working hard, in those realms. And you can even see in the chat, Radha talked about putting together a call, and we'd be happy to support you, Radha, with having any of these people come together and having another conversation where we can talk in, more terms about at the state level. So with that said, though, I would like to thank greatly Radha for joining us today. She has been absolutely wonderful. We do see her once in a while at different events, and hopefully, Radha, we can have you come and join us again maybe at some point.
I would love that. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to everyone that took the time out of their day to participate.
We are also going to put in the chat some of this information, so you do have the ECE contact information. Do not hesitate to get connected with them on social media, because they do tend to update those things. Again, just for those on here, you can have a certificate mailed to you, and Sarah's sending that out to you. And I think there's two, one of the things that's coming up is we do have an ebook that's being released it's just been released here. This is an ebook that has nothing to do with what we were just talking about, but it's really about your own self-care in the childcare industry as being an administrator or an operator. It's free to download. Just come to inspirecare360.com and go to resources, and you will find that free ebook. We are always trying to help out the industry as best as possible. And also on our next webinar, this will be coming up on May 9th, is Nick Williams, founder and CEO of Childcare Business Growth. We have become a strategic partner with them in the States. They're out of the UK. Nick and his team just do an amazing job, and we're going to be talking to him about sort of how they go about the whole idea of getting your school and the reputation out there in the community in the best light possible, and really be an additional source for the marketing side of your business. So definitely sign up for that program. And here's a little information on who we are. For most of you, you already know this, but if you need anything from us, we're there to help you. And if we can help you in any way in your advocacy in this industry, we are all about it. As you know, we own and operate schools too, but we also want to participate in, raising the tide for all the ships in this industry. So Radha, thank you again very much for your time. This is Tony D'Agostino. I am founder and CEO of Inspire Care 360. Thank you for joining us for our executive webinar series, and have a wonderful day. Take care, everybody. Bye now.